are one of more most important Mormon ethers. Are you think you are Mormon ethers?
Well, yeah, I would say that's true. I mean, it depends on how you talk about importance, you know. I mean, I've written a lot of books for Mormon readers, and I was kind of there at the beginning when Deseret Book wasn't publishing novels. Mine was the first one that they published, and so I've had some influence. They're a lot better writers than I am, but I've done a lot in that field. But I also, about 2/3 of my books are published in New York with other publishers other than LDS publishers.
What you are you think yourself? Are you put yourself like with other ethers like just ether, or you like to send message for people from your books, or just you like to write books?
Well, you know, I think when you write fiction, the first thing you want to do is create a good story, something that someone really enjoys reading,
Yeah.
and it engages you, and you want to know how it's going to turn out. And I write a lot of my books for children and young adults, and then it's especially important to get their interest and keep it. But I always want to get people to think about things, and so I write a lot of historical novels because that's an interesting way to learn history, by doing it in a fictional form so that you feel as though you're at some event in the history. And I've done a lot of books about early Mormons and the history of the LDS Church. But I'm always looking at what is right and wrong and what's moral, and how should we make choices. And I'm writing right now a book that really gets into the issue of to what degree is it okay to think for yourself, and to what degree should you listen to your church leaders? And where's the balance between those two things, for instance? So I don't give an answer, but I try to get people thinking about that.
Okay, I have a question.
Okay?
Your old is after 14, yeah?
Well,
Your old is above 14.
I'm above 14, yes,
Yeah.
I am, yeah.
But how, on your side, how old are you? Are you still children?
No, I don't think I feel that way.
Why I feel
Yeah.
this way? Why I feel you are just...
What-
I feel there's a children's
Yeah.
age.
Well,
You
yeah,
smile.
yeah, we all have that inside of us, I think, but some of us forget it more than others. And I think it's really important, especially if you're going to write for young people,
Yeah.
that you retain that sense of what it was like to be young, how you thought about the world when you were young. So if you're writing about a 12-year-old who's in 6th grade or something like that, you try to project yourself back to what the things were you cared about and you did in 6th grade. The world changes a lot. What a 6th grader does now compared to what I did when I was in 6th grade. I mean, that was when TV was brand new. I mean, when I was in 6th grade, we did have a TV by then, I think, but it was something we'd just finally gotten, you know. And but now with all the electronics and everything that kids are doing,
Yeah.
they spend their lives in a very different way than I did.
Yeah.
But I don't think they're that different from what I was like. I think human beings are always sort of the same in any time period. And so that's why I feel like I can try to write historical fiction and write about another era, because maybe the conditions were different, and the culture was different, and all kinds of things were different. But inside, I think there's something basic about human beings that is always alive.
Can you talk what was your childhood?
Well, I grew up in Ogden, Utah, which is, in northern Utah, and I came from quite a poor family. We had my first house was a trailer house.
Trailer?
Yeah, do you know what a trailer house
Yeah,
is?
I know.
Yeah, and it was a little tiny thing that would be like what if you go on a camping trip now, those trailers are bigger than what our house was. It was 8 feet wide and 16 feet long.
And how many child?
And I had a big brother at that time, so there were 4 of us living in a room about as big as this office,
Yeah.
And we didn't have running water. We had a bucket of water, and then we had a bathroom that we went to that was in another building, and my dad it was during World War II. I was born in 1943, and so it was a very simple life, and I didn't exactly think of myself as poor. It wasn't until I got a little older that I understood that most people had a lot more than I did, but we didn't suffer. Dad always worked, and he always had a paycheck, and so it was not as though I thought, I'm deprived or anything, but we didn't have very much. My dad quit school at the end of 8th grade to work on his father's farm. He couldn't read very well, and he had problems with alcohol too, and so that had a lot to do with my early years. I was never very close to my father. I was very close to my mother, and I was always a little ashamed of my dad because he would drink, and then he would talk foolishly and embarrass me in front of my friends and things like that. So that was part of my growing up. And I think at a very young age, I made up my mind, I want to be somebody. I want to do something important in the world. I want to achieve something great. And as life went on, I realized that what you achieve in life is not nearly so important as who you become, the person you are. That's what life is for. But when you're young, you want to be a great sports star, or you want to do something, and so when I was about 13 or 14, I started talking about that I wanted to be a writer when I grew up, and in my mind that would make me important, and so I really worked toward that all while I was growing up, trying to get to the point where I could make a living at writing, and I was able to do it, but I did it as much by tenacity, just sticking with it and trying to learn and trying to keep sending out manuscripts and finally getting there. But I was never a genius at it. I was never gifted. Some people can sit down and write much more easily than I can. But often they don't have the same ability to stick with it and finish what they started. And what I have had is that ability to start a project and follow it all the way through and get it finished and work with publishers and so forth. But I went to college with the idea in mind that I'd like to be a writer, but I didn't think I could really make a living at it. So I studied to become a professor, and I became an English professor, at first literature primarily. And after about 8 years, I decided, I got a book sold. It was a children's book, and I thought, I'm going to take a year off and write full time for 1 year. Well, that turned into 17 years. And so I wrote full time for 17 years. And then I went back and taught again at Brigham Young University. And when I went back, I taught all creative writing.
First book, what is the name for the first book?
Now, my first book, see that picture right there? No, that's not it.
Yeah.
Where is it? Oh, down here.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the cover art for it. It was called Under the Same Stars. And it was
it's so famous, really.
No.
No, I read this book.
It was a book about the early church and a young boy living in Missouri.
What the story? This story is about child.
Yeah.
I think it's for children, or this thing is for everybody.
Well, a lot of good children's books anyone can enjoy reading, and probably the greatest American novel is Huckleberry Finn, which was written for children or young adults, but everybody has always read it, And so I think a good book for young people becomes a book that adults enjoy reading too. But the target audience, the way they market it, the way they send it out, is for children.
All the time you're here for, or your story is child. All the time, or sometime child, sometime not.
I'm not sure what you mean.
Your first character in your story is child.
Yeah. And in all my early books, my first books, they were always, I wrote all of those with children readers in mind, or teenagers. But then in the 1990s, I had the idea, actually Kathy wanted me to write about the 1940s and World War II. And we got talking about that, and I had an idea of what I wanted to write, but I realized it wasn't a children's book. And so I wrote a series called Children of the Promise, and that became my best-selling series. The ones right over there, and those were my most successful books that I did. And so those are written for children. All the books on that shelf, on that level, are written for adults, or well, a couple of those are for teenagers. But the ones on the upper shelves are all for children and younger readers.
442.
442 is a book that takes place in World War II, and it's about a group of, a company, not a company, but a battalion of soldiers that were called the 442nd, but the soldiers called it the 442. But they were Japanese Americans who fought for the United States. So here they were rounded up and put into camps, not allowed to live in our society because they were Japanese heritage, even though they were citizens. And but many of them volunteered to go fight the Germans in World War II, and they were sent to first Italy and then France and fought over there. So that book follows those soldiers through some really difficult battles.
Okay. As child in your story, is you?
No,
Parts from you?
Well, you always have to paint, or when you're painting, I assume, or when you're writing. I think a lot of it has to come from how you see the world, how you feel about things. And so if you're writing about a young man who's, say, 19 years old and goes off to fight in Europe in the war, all you can do, since I didn't fight in any wars, all I can do is read all that I can, hear what other people say about it, but finally try to think how I would react. And so in every book, I know that I'm often putting myself into it, and maybe sometimes wrongly, but that's the only way I know you can do it, is to try to think how you would feel in that situation. And I try to do that with women too. I write a lot about women, and I try to project, how would a woman feel in this situation? Is it different?
How old are you when you are married?
I got married when I was 23, and Kathy was 22. At that time, most Americans got married about that age. Nowadays, Americans tend to wait longer, but Latter-day Saint young people still marry younger than most Americans.
Okay. What's life before marriage, life after marriage? What would change?
Well, when we got married, Kathy had finished college, and I was still in college, and I was in my senior year, and then we went to graduate school the next year. We moved up to Seattle, and so, I don't know. Everything's different in one sense, and then nothing was different in another. I continued to go to school, and she was teaching at first, and then we had children. But
might be more easy or more difficult.
Well, I think some things are more difficult because you have to think about someone besides yourself, and some things are a lot easier because you have a companion for everything you do.
Your father in this time is still alive.
Yeah.
You was with your father. Now you are alone. You have your family.
Mm-hmm.
What's the relation with your father in this time?
Well, my relationship got somewhat better after I was married, but it was never great. He was not a person who knew how to express his feelings. He's
the old American man.
Yeah, I guess.
Cowboy?
Yeah, not a cowboy, but he was a blue collar worker, as we say.
Yeah.
He worked. He repaired cars, not mechanics, but the body of the car.
The old fashioned man.
Yeah, in a lot of ways he was, and
he's not have the feeling to connect with his son. It's just so sharp.
Yeah. He never once in his whole life told me that he loved me. He just couldn't say those words,
He can't. He can't, or he is Or he's
Or-
don't know how can they.
Yeah, whatever it was, whether he was too embarrassed to say it or whether he just didn't think about it.
I don't think he can say it.
Yeah, he never did, you know.
Yeah.
And so,
But what's your relation with your mom?
my relationship with my mom was always really great, and we could talk about a lot of things, and she was so proud of me when I started publishing.
I'm proud of you. I think every American person is proud of you. You are so success. You are angel human. Have a beautiful family. You have 100. How much now? It's before 100.
It's 103, I think.
103. You have many books and people everywhere in the world now because the internet can you come there, connect and buy your books.
Yeah, but you know, some things sound more important than other things, and they're not. I mean, supposing I had gotten a job as an attorney, which is what I first thought I might study in college,
Yeah.
and I had, you know, become a partner in my firm, and I had represented a lot of people and made a good living and had a nice family and everything. For some reason, people pay attention to that you've published books, and they make it sound more important. But we all just find something we like to do to try to make a living. And it took me a while. At first I thought, I must be important, I'm writing books. And then after a while I realized, no, I'm not. Most people have never heard of me. Most people don't know my books. And when they hear about them, they'll say, oh, really? What books have you written? I'll name off some of my books, and they'll say, oh, I haven't heard of those, you know.
But
So it's not that big of a deal, really.
I was in a Fresno, and when I say your name for people say, who?
Well, in the church, some people have
No,
read my books.
almost
And
people there that know you. They're just humble.
no, I've never been very humble. It's just that gradually you realize that it's not as important as all that.
You know, you have something so certain. I see many hundred artists in our land, and they're big artists. Some of them in voice, you know, this program voice. When I be with room along with them and talk with them, I see them suffered from people not know me. I say, how can people don't know you? You are so famous. Everybody know you.
Yeah.
No, you see Instagram, people don't like it. They say that about me. They say that about me. I say, no, you are so famous.
Yeah.
Anyone dream you take your place. And them say, oh, them so pretty artists, and there's million love them. But she think she is. There's no anyone. No, I don't know why. I see almost artists, almost writers.
Yeah.
Or they have same problem.
Yeah.
Not almost people know them.
Well, but it's just that your experience, you know, you go along and you know, you're talking to someone and someone does recognize your name and you think, oh, well, that's nice that they recognize my name. But then the next 40 people you talk to don't know your name and you get so you don't expect them to, and they usually don't, and it doesn't matter anymore.
Some people don't. Some people I see in their life and say something from Altus to Maya on history, and then say this is from Maya, and this is from Altus to Maya. You say, oh, I don't read this.
Yeah.
It's book of God, and then don't read it. There's not all people can read all books, but you are humble. But you are have same problem with all artists and writers. I see that with all them. And I am now in your house. Your house so pretty castle really.
No.
It's not house. I think it's house. It's not house. It's a beautiful house. I hear from your wife you are design here the furniture with hair. You are put the furniture with hair. That's real. You design this.
Well, yeah, but with it, you know, a man came in and said, what if it was like this or like that? And we said, no, let's do it this way or that way. But most of the design was by a man who does carpentry.
But you are just help, but not you are put the design.
No, yeah, well, yeah, I said, no, do this instead of that, but that was all. He designed it pretty much.
Okay. Like American person, you are. What you look for American society today? What you look, what you see?
Well, I'm sort of sick about what's happened to America. People are so divided right now. You know, you see, you know, something like President Trump. People either despise him or they love him, well, it's not quite true, but I mean, but they're with him or not, and it's gotten so people don't like each other if they vote for someone different. It hasn't always been that way. I think people tend to go to the same news sources over and over that reinforce what they already think. So if they're conservatives, they watch Fox News, and if they're liberals, they watch MSN or something like that, and they reinforce what they already believe, and then they're just so angry at each other and so divided. And I just think it's a toxic society we live in now, and people are so openly critical and mean-spirited in politics, but in a lot of other ways too. And there are lots of wonderful, wonderful people in this world, but it seems like all you have to do is bring up politics, and all of a sudden they pull back from each other and can't talk to each other. I hate to see that.
You live in Kennedy time, at GF Kennedy.
Yeah.
You are young in this time.
I was a missionary when Kennedy was shot.
Yeah, what you look for Kennedy in this time? What you look for him?
I loved Kennedy. My dad was a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat, and Kennedy was my great hero. And he was young, and he gave great speeches, and we didn't know that his life wasn't always that moral. We know it now, but in those days, you didn't know some of the things they did behind the scenes. But I just thought he was a great man with great leadership. And then I was in Germany as a missionary.
Yeah.
And someone came up to me and said, "What's going to happen in your country now?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "President Kennedy was shot and killed today." And I was just stunned. You know, I was brokenhearted about it.
Before this years when the new presidents come, you was love the president really. You were broken heart when he's died. Oh, that's nice.
Yeah.
And you remember Kennedy? Are you remember something between Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe? There is a talk about that, or people don't know about that?
No, people know about that now, but they didn't know it at the time.
In this time?
Yeah, at the time when he was president and his seeing Marilyn Monroe, there must have been some people knew about it, but it was not widely known. I mean, President Roosevelt was in a wheelchair, and people didn't realize it for the most part, because he would have someone stand him up and he would speak, and then they'd take the cameras off and he would sit down, and no one reported that. I mean, there was a time when reporting wasn't as probing as it is now.
Yeah. Which president you love him more in all these years you are from Kennedy to now?
Well, I'll give myself away. I really like President Obama.
Obama.
And I live in a state where he was hated, and I live among, a lot of members of my church couldn't stand him, but I really liked him as a person, and he was president during a really difficult time, and it was hard for him to do very much. But I always thought he was a good man, and his heart was in the right place. And not many of my friends felt that way. Needless to say, I'm just sick about President Trump. I think that he has no morals. He doesn't know what truth is, and that's disheartening. It's embarrassing. I think the way he behaves in world affairs is embarrassing to the United States. But a lot of people love him.
When you are a child, you read for who?
What books did I read? No.
First book you read it. First book you read it not in school, no, but out of the school. The book you like it.
I don't.
I like it.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't remember. I started to read a lot very young.
Yeah, and which book in this time is just sticky?
I don't know. There was a book called A Separate Peace
Separate piece.
that I read when I was maybe in junior high that I really loved. I read all kinds of things. I like to read biographies of famous people, and I got into my science fiction age when I was in junior high. I read a lot of science fiction,
Yeah.
and then when I was in high school, by then I decided I wanted to be a writer, so I decided I had to read all the great books in the history of Western civilization. So I got a list of great books and I started reading one right after the other. I read all the European novels and the Russian novels, the American novels, and especially British novels. And so I really got into reading the classics at a pretty young age.
Yeah. Like a writer, what you think people like today?
Well, I think what's happened a lot is our entertainment has gone more and more to the big, loud, raucous things, and so the blockbuster movies are either about superheroes or they're thrillers with car chases and people being shot up and knocked around and plots that are over the top, just with wild turns of events and everything, and I don't like any of that. I don't like violence. I don't like to watch violence. I don't like to see people. I don't mind a war movie if it's accurate and makes you feel that war is appalling as it is. But these movies and books that glamorize brutal violence, I can't stand. And so I like books that really are about people and relationships and about values.
In Book of Mormon, I see, like it says, science fiction. Sometimes there's something. If we go to Star Wars and see these things, there's something like that in the Book of Mormon, like the ships and how come to America,
Oh, yeah.
and this light was from Rome,
Yeah.
and all these things. How do you use these things like this?
Well, I think adventure, someone getting in a ship and going across the ocean, or something like that.
But these people look like hero, and there's a power
Yeah.
out. Why you don't make your hero like now is this hero and everywhere you see it, Iron Man and all these things and Wonder Woman. Why not make a Mormon hero?
Well, I think I do make Mormon heroes, but not in that same sense. They're not.
Because if you like to today, you connect people in America and teenager, you must work on same what them like.
Well, to some degree, but I think, for instance, I wrote a book about a woman who was a Relief Society president in a little town in Utah during the Great Recession, or what am I trying to say, the Great Depression, and she doesn't really want to be a Relief Society president, but someone's needed who's kind of tough.
Yeah.
And the bishop calls her and she says, no, I would be the last person to be a good Relief Society president. He says, no, I want you and the Lord wants you. So she accepts that calling and she serves the people and she comes to love them, and she softens, but she also uses some of that toughness in her to help people when they need some toughness. That's, to me, a hero. She doesn't have to shoot anybody.
You like the Gandhi system. Gandhi?
Yeah.
Mahatma Gandhi. The system was like Mother Teresa.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
system. The hero, the reality hero.
Yeah,
Not
yeah.
hero have a fire in his hand and
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
okay.
Yeah.
I understand, you like the reality
Good
hero.
people who stand up for other people, who learn and get better, and right now I'm dealing with a guy who he's a young man. He gets married. He's called to go settle this new place, and he doesn't really want to go. and Brigham Young calls him to go help to build up the settlement, and he doesn't want to go, but he goes, and then he certain things happen that cause him to wish he hadn't accepted the calling, but he does it anyway, and he keeps growing. He becomes a better and stronger person, and gradually becomes a leader. And that's the same kind of thing, where there's no action in the sense of thrilling things. There's a flood in the community and some things like that, but overall, it's good people trying to do their best, struggling through a difficult world, and becoming more like Christ as time goes by.
I just think that society today walking to shallow, more shallow and more shallow. I just think.
Yeah, I think so. Every generation thinks the younger generation is not up to much, and it may be unfair, but certainly there's a lot of evidence of shallowness, I think, in terms of not being as sensitive or caring as they could be, or not thinking as much or as carefully as they might, and maybe they grow into it. I also I know within the LDS Church, I meet a lot of really outstanding young people, really amazing young people who are devoted to carrying out what they've been called upon to do. And so, even as I say that, I think our society is more superficial, but it doesn't mean that all the young people are.
Okay. Why do you think America is great?
Why do I think America is great?
What is the base for this greatness?
Well, first of all, I think Switzerland is great.
Yeah.
I've been to Switzerland a couple of times when we were there this year. It's an absolutely stunningly beautiful place, and they're nice people, and they've stayed out of wars, and I think that Lebanon is great in its own way. We lived there for a year and a half, and I came to love the people. They've gone through a lot, and they're resilient. A lot of the Iraqis I met were so resilient. They had been kicked out of their country, or had to leave because of bombing or whatever, and yet they were just trying to survive, go forward. So I don't think there's a great value in saying that one country is better than another country. And America's been too much into that, I think. Having said that, I think there are certain things about the great American experiment, as we call it, that really is noble. And that was the idea that everyone has a vote, although in the beginning blacks didn't and women didn't, but over time that's evolved, and that idea that you have the freedom to decide and to elect your representatives, and that you work together and try to solve problems and move forward. And I think overall, America's been quite generous. Sometimes when you give money to other countries, you do it for selfish reasons. You want them to do something in return for you. But overall, like the way we rebuilt Europe after World War II, and in many cases, we've given an awful lot of aid to the rest of the world. We've prospered as a people, but we've also been generous to others. Now, we've got our faults. Americans can be really proud and arrogant, and I think sometimes we're too materialistic. I think we love to work hard and get ahead, we say,
Yeah.
and meaning get ahead of someone else, that we're competitive with each other. And to some degree that's good. Competitiveness can bring out the best in us, but it can also bring out a kind of an animosity and a comparison. People who feel that, someone's car is bigger than mine and someone's house is bigger than mine, and just that comparison thing that we get into. And so Americans can be quite, we don't have a caste system in theory. No one's better than anyone else in theory, but in reality, when it comes to economics, there is a feeling that a lot of people have that, I'm not part of this. It's a great prosperous country, but I'm not part of it. I can't get in. I don't have the same opportunity that others do. And to some degree, those opportunities, I think, have been diminished. When I went to college, I came out of that really poor family, But when I went to college, it cost me $45 a term to take a full load of classes. I lived at home, and I mean, for a couple $100 a year, I could go to college. Now it's gotten so expensive that a lot of people are sort of priced out of the capacity. California is one of the places where it's somewhat better than a lot of the nations, but most colleges these days are very, very expensive, and if you take out a lot of loans, you can get stuck with those loans forever, and so I think it's harder to ride through the system than it used to be.
Okay. If you today see Dean Hughes when he is in 20, this is my advice. But I don't know if you can make him say yes. Because I don't know. If you know, I have in Quran there is a part from Quran they say Moses he is walking river of Nile and he is take a die fish and God said for him when this fish go back again there's like a door you will see someone. Some people say this person is the God, or some people say this person is Moses when he's old. He see himself and he started to let him advise, but Moses don't take any advice. He seeks advice, but he don't take any advice. In the end, he explained for him what he doing, but Moses after all that he don't understand that. He just say, I don't understand what he doing. If you today go to the dean, this door is open and you go back to what you tell him.
I think my mistake at 20 was to think that that achievement was the purpose of life. That if I could become a writer, I could be a happy man. That's what I wanted. I was going to do whatever it took to get to that place. Yeah. And then I thought, and once I get there, everything will be great. I'll be happy. I'll be well off, and it just isn't that way. You don't, achievement doesn't make you important, and writing didn't turn out to make me rich. It was a good living, but it wasn't what I imagined it would be. But what I should have been thinking about, at 20 years old, I was a missionary. I should have been much more focused on what kind of person will I be by the time I die. When I was 60, I had cancer. And it was prostate cancer, and I had my prostate removed, and the doctor said, it looks good, 90% chance, we've gotten it all, and you're going to be fine. And as it turned out, that was right, but you don't know that. When they tell you 90%, there's 10% it's not true. And so I said to myself, what if I died right away? I'm 60 years old now, what if I died? Yeah, I wanted to be a writer, I became a writer, that's good, but I wanted to be a good father. Was I as good as I could have been? I'm not sure. Was I as good a husband as I could have been? But even more important, have I become a Christ-like person in my life? And that's such a lofty goal that it's discouraging, but at the same time, it wasn't what I was thinking about through most of my life. It was kind of, we always said it, that it wasn't my main thrust to ask myself over and over, how would I behave if I wanted to be the person that I think I should be. And so I wish I had started earlier to try to put first things first in that regard.
Yeah. What made you happy?
Well, now, I think the other interesting thing is that you start out life and you think, I want to get these things for me. But as soon as you start having children, then you start thinking how much it means to you to see your children have the chance to prosper and do well and do the best they can. And then you start thinking about your grandchildren. And right now, nothing makes me happier than to see my grandchildren making good choices and doing well. And nothing worries me more than when I see them struggling and making mistakes, And so, and then, Kathy and I now have a pretty nice life. we're not pressured in a lot of ways, and I can get up and write for as long as I want to each day, and we can go for, once I get my back straight, we can go for walks and things, and just that kind of peaceful retirement life where I don't have to feel driven anymore all the time. I've got 3 book contracts right now, and I shouldn't have. I should not be saying I got to write 3 more books, but I'm not. But they're not hurried contracts. I don't have to have them by a quick deadline, and I like to write, so I'd rather sit down at my computer and write than just have nothing to do all day. But I like to be able to, like yesterday, Kathy said, Dean, it's a beautiful morning, let's drive up to Mirror Lake. And so I just didn't write. And we got in the car and we drove up to Mirror Lake, and I took those pictures that I showed you.
Yeah.
And it was just gorgeous. It was just peaceful. And we can do that now. We can just say, okay, today we'll just have a nice relaxing day. We'll have some fun.
Okay, what makes you sad?
I get frustrated with myself, that I see in myself, I'm not as good a person as I wish I were.
You're a good person.
And sometimes things get discouraging. Just once again,
I need from you something. I need you to tell me what Dean Hughes
what is Dean Hughes like?
No, what is Dean Hughes?
Oh, what is Dean Hughes? Well, I don't know. I think we're all really complex. I think human beings have all kinds of urges and needs and worries and different things working on us all the time. And you know, I like to be a nice person. I like to be around people who are kind, and so I want to be kind. But a lot of times, that's not what I feel, you know, and I do things that are not as kind as they could be. Or I don't like a lot of fuss in my life. I like things to be kind of peaceful. And when I get pulled upon by too many things to do, I sometimes get sort of frustrated and not very nice. And you know, I have fairly strong opinions about things, and yet I try to remember that that's all it is an opinion. That you know, I think differently from a lot of the people I know. And I know a lot of it comes from your own background, your education, things you do in your life. I think to be an artist or a writer, you kind of you see the world somewhat differently than someone who's, say, a business person or a doctor or something like that, and so you're part of all those forces that are coming along, and I don't know how to put my finger on any of it. I don't know who I am exactly, and I think we all sort of know that we really wouldn't want anyone to know all of our thoughts.
That's a bigger problem, really.
And so you know yourself inside, and sometimes you know that you're petty and worthless and everything else, you know. And so I don't know. I don't know who I am. I'm this struggling guy, getting old, very aware that I'm 75 now, and I see people who are in their 80s, and I think, man, they're really old, and I'm almost there now, you know. And then you start thinking, what's next? You know, what if I get to the point where I can't do a lot of the things I like to do now? Kathy's father lived to be 101, and he died in a retirement home, and he had lost a lot of his mental capacity at the end, and I just think, you know, what's coming? Am I going to have to go through really bad diseases, and am I going to end up losing my capacity mentally, and so it's kind of a fearful time for me right now. It's not as though I walk around with it all the time, but I hear someone say, "Oh, he was an elderly man. He was 73," and I say, "Wait a minute, 73 is not elderly. 83 is elderly." But now I'm getting on toward 83, you know, and so I don't know who I am. I really don't.
But I don't know. I see you just scared from one person life. Just you put someone and say I scared from you. But there's many people them still for lost their own life creative and
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. But why you scared?
But you know, I've had quite a few friends just in the last few years who've either died or gotten some really serious disease, and it's just changed their lives entirely. Kathy and I like to travel, and we keep saying we better take some trips now because maybe before long we won't be able to. You know.
Yeah. But in Iraq, the people die in 20.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
You must don't be sad.
Yeah, no, but when you get to be 75, you know that the odds are getting more and more against you. You know. Mm.
Maybe I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't be 75 years. Okay, I must say thank you for Mr. Dean Hughes.
It's fun.
He is one from most important author. He's humble, he say I don't, but he is, and he is one of the best people I see it in the life. I wish there's a 100 in America. America is the best country in the world, really. If there's a 100 person like him, he's a professor, he's a writer, he is father, he's good friend, he was bishop. All these things, he think he's don't do anything. I don't know why, and he has a beautiful smile. Yeah, he's still young. He is.
Thank you, dear Kosei.
He is like to say, I'm old. I don't know why. Can you explain for me what? Yeah. Mr. Dean, Dean Hughes and his wife, Miss Kitty.
This is one that I made. This is one of my favorites.
Like Christmas things.
Around the neighborhood. It's got all the things in the neighborhood. Houses
It's like
and
big
churches.
art piece. It's art piece,
And
really.
on the back,
Oh, so nice. It look like Christmas colors.
yeah, kind of the Christmas colors.
Miss Kitty,
Uh-huh.
what do you think about Dean Hughes, like writer?
What do I think about him?
Yeah.
Well, some days are better than others. He's a good man.
Yeah.
He doesn't mind me when he's sick, though. He won't do what I tell him to get better. And so I have to be strict with him and like the mother.
The mother.
Yeah.
Are you think he's still child?
No, he's not a child,
You scored a touchdown.
except when BYU plays. And then he's like a child.
No. You scored a touchdown anyway.
They did, so that's
Okay. When you read his books,
good. I do. I read all of his books.
yeah, which book you near from your heart more than another one?
I think the series that he talked about with World War II,
Yeah.
those are my favorite.
Why?
Well, partly because he's created a family situation that I think is really wonderful. It's kind of a family story
Yeah.
about families and how they hang together during hard times and when war comes especially. But
Thank you, Mrs. Katie.
you're welcome.